are all part of the graduate school. They each have a book, which I hope you saw there, and of course, everyone hopes you'll buy. So what we're going to do is each one will talk about her book for about 10 minutes, and then we'll have questions of anybody after that. So if you have questions for whoever speaks first, just remember them, and then at the end, we'll do that. And we will speak in this order. Patricia Gandara will talk about her book, The Latino Education Crisis, The Consequences of Failed Social Policies. Linda Sachs will talk about her book, The Gender Gap in College, Maximizing the Developmental Potential of Women and Men. And Jane Margolis will talk about her book, Stuck in the Shallow End, Education, Race, and Computing. And while I can't say that I've read every word of each of the books, I know a lot about the work, and I've read some of each of them, and they, I think, are all really interesting with interesting things to say. So you get a little snippet from each of them now. Patricia?
And now we are going to try and do this very quickly. And so one thinks about, okay, how do I present, what took me 2 years to write in 10 minutes? But so what I want to do is I want to tell you what motivated this book, why I wrote this book, and then I will just tell you very briefly what you will find in the book. The motivation for this book comes from two primary things. One being that I've spent about the last 3 decades of my life studying the issue of Latino achievement. And as I was writing some stuff one day and kind of tracking educational progress, particularly in higher education for Latinos, I sat there looking at a chart that just left me kind of dumbfounded. And you find it on page 24 of the book. And basically what it tells you is that for the last 3 decades, we have seen incremental but consistent progress for all other, we don't show all others, but we know that, for all other ethnic groups. Whites have been continuing to increase the numbers of bachelor's degrees they get. African Americans have been continuing at a much lower level, but continuing an upward movement in the degrees that they get. Asians have continued. But Latinos are basically flat for 3 decades, bouncing around between about 9% and 11% of the population gets a BA degree or higher. We compare that to getting close to 50% for Asians. That's the first thing, because when you think about that in the context of a state like California, in which virtually half of the school-age population now is Latino, a state like Texas, which is only a couple percentage points behind that, that has to spell disaster for the society, not just for these young people, but for the society as a whole. So that's the first thing that motivates it. The second thing that motivates this book is a young man, and I call him Andres. And he's among many of the studies that we've done following kids of all kinds of backgrounds through high school and on to college if they make it. Andres stood out extraordinarily to me. This is a young man I came to know pretty much just about the first day of the 9th grade for him. And he was part of a very large sample of students that we were following, but we had decided we were going to follow 27 kids for about 5 years. And we were going to see what happens to these kids. And so, how much time do I have? I'm staying 10 minutes.
I'll give you like.
Oh, would you? Thank you. Okay, good. Thank you. I mean, because I can go on. I didn't have that. I don't want to. So this is this young man starting in the 9th grade. I get to know him. I kind of ask him how's school going and what does he think about school? And he says, well, that's okay. I have a hard time understanding things sometimes, so I have to pay a lot of attention in class, but I'm doing okay. And I assumed from this first conversation that he was a young man, just like many Latino kids, who's maybe doing okay, but really struggling in school. I went back and looked at his transcripts, and he had an absolute 4.0. He hadn't gotten anything less than an A. And as I came to know on this, I came to see that this was a kid who was really knocking himself out. He spoke Spanish at home, but he decided he would take German as his language because that was more of a challenge. He tried to take every AP class that was available, and he did well. But perhaps the most important thing about Andres was that he had pulled together a young group of kids around him, his friends, and he told me one day, he said, you know, my goal is that we're all going to college together. And another time I came in, we had an appointment in the morning, we sat down and talked, and he came in kind of bleary-eyed, and so I teased him, you know, I says, hard night of partying, huh, Andres? He says, well, no, not really, it's because, what's her name, you know, one of the girls in the group had a paper due this morning, and so I was up all night with her editing it, and since we only had one typewriter, you know, I was helping her type it. This is the kind of kid that Andres was. Andres also, you know now that he has a high GPA, he's challenging himself, he's in a college access program, that's how I found him, so he did identify as a kid, and he was being given some resources. This is a kid who should have made it. You will see in the book that Andres is the only kid from that group who did not go to college. All of his friends went on, and he stayed behind because his mom had 3 children, and the family was living on what she could make as a part-time job at McDonald's and a paper route. And he could not see leaving the family in this circumstance. We followed Andres for a while afterward. We lost him for a while, found him. He was kind of moving around in the community colleges. But it's made me think a lot about what is it in kids' lives, even when they are high achievers, that gets in the way? And what is it that schools can do, and what is it that schools can't do in order to change the problem that we have? So this book, I know I must be down for about 2 minutes. Yeah, okay. So in the book, let me just tell you kind of what we go through. Chapter 1 deals with both the politics and the policy around, in this country, around the education of Latino kids. Chapter 2 deals with the social context in which these kids are being raised. You can imagine chapter 2 is a real important chapter for me. Chapter 3 is the educational context and what we know about the kinds of schools that these kids go to. Chapter 4 asks the question, is language the problem? Is it really about language? Because this, of course, is the primary intervention for Latino kids, is always must be something about language. Chapter 5 is a look at those 27 kids, and we actually pare it down a bit. So you get to know the lives of some of these kids and why it is that we end up with the outcomes that we end up with, even when things look rosier in the beginning. Chapter 6 talks about the kids who do make it. What do we know about the kids who do make it? What are the characteristics of their environments and the kids themselves? Chapter 7 is what do we know about interventions? What works and how much does it cost? And what would it really take if we were to actually commit ourselves to doing this? Well, I actually tried putting a dollar figure on it, you know, just because, so the policymakers will take a look and realize this is not going to come cheap. But if that's what you want to do, you're going to have to pay for it. And the last chapter is what I call the chapter that was written for the Obama administration. It's a series of things that we can do right now if we want to get moving. And they're not necessarily even the big ticket items, but they're the things that we can start doing tomorrow. That's it.
Thank you.
Okay, well, hi, it's nice to see everyone here. So I'm going to also try to do this very briefly. And first, what is this book about? Well, my book is a study of how gender shapes the experience of students in college. And like most research that we do in social sciences, it's driven by our own personal experiences. For me, it had to do with my experiences as it related to math and confidence in college. And all of my life, up through high school, I was very confident in math. I loved calculus, and then I went to college. And up until that point, I had never thought of math as a male domain. I had assumed that the women's movement had leveled the playing field. But then I got to college, and I enrolled in a calculus course. I was up at Berkeley, which is unlike, I mean, it's like probably any other campus in the situation, where a was in a very large lecture class. I noticed that there were very few women, and I noticed that the study groups that were being formed were primarily male, because most of the students were male. I didn't know how to break into those study groups. I noticed that the comments that the female students did make in the discussion sections seemed to be taken less seriously. And I started to feel that math and science were less connected to the things that I cared about. And so I was someone who moved out of math and science and into the social sciences, into history and political science and sociology, areas that I saw where you could use quantitative methods to make a difference and to study issues that seemed relevant. Well, I wondered at that time as an undergraduate whether my growing disinterest in math had to do with my own changing interests, or was a function of my gender? Was it a function of being female in a male-dominated field? So those personal experiences evolved into a research agenda on women's and men's experiences in college. And I've spent about 20 years doing this work, and I have about 8 remaining minutes to talk about what I've learned. So there's two primary questions that I addressed in the book. The first is, what are the ways in which women and men differ from each other when they get to college? So just basically, over the past 40 years, using data from the Higher Ed Research Institute, we have 8 million students surveyed over the past 40 years. And so we look at how women and men differ from each other when they arrive at college. The second question is, how does college differentially affect the development of women and men? So it's a question of, is there differential impact? And for that, I used a smaller database. It was about 17,000 students who were surveyed from 200 colleges over 4 years. And so what did I find? So first, I want to give you 3 interesting findings from the long-term trends question and 3 interesting findings from the college impact question. So first, for the long-term trends, when people think about the gender gap in higher education today, mostly what they think about is the gender gap in enrollment. So women are 58% of college students nationwide, and actually I think a little higher here at UCLA. And what's important to know is that the increase in the enrollment of women over this time has come primarily from women from low-income backgrounds, women from racial ethnic minority groups, and women who are first-generation college students. So the good news is that this represents access and growing access for women from underrepresented populations in higher education. But this also means that we have growing numbers of women coming into college who have financial concerns, who are not sure they're going to make it through school because of those financial concerns, have to take on jobs, etc. So that's one area, so I'm going really quickly. Okay, the second area where there's really persistent gender gaps that are important has to do with self-confidence. We ask on these surveys how women rate themselves and how men rate themselves, and on a variety of traits. And we find that over 40 years, women consistently rate themselves significantly lower than men. We're talking double digits lower than men in their math ability and in intellectual self-confidence, and that those gaps had not changed in 40 years. You would have imagined that over the last 40 years, there'd be some convergence of the gender gap in self-confidence. There has not been, at least according to these data. We also find women to be less confident in their, or at least reporting less confidence in their emotional well-being, their physical well-being. So that's a whole area, gets a lot of attention in the book. I also want to point out my co-author for chapter 2, Emily Arms, is here, so right there. And that's the chapter where we talk about those trends. Another interesting area of gender difference is in time allocation. So how do students spend their time? We find that both before college and during college, women are spending significantly more time than men studying, talking with teachers, working in clubs and groups, volunteering, and helping out their families with housework and childcare. This continues on into college. This leads to a greater level of stress, of course, for women students, and partly stress with just the time management. And we find for men, on the other hand, what do they do more often than women? Usually people can guess these, but I won't take the time to guess them, but people are always accurate. Men spend more time than women exercising, watching television, partying, and significantly more time, more than anything else, playing video games. And so what we find here is that on the one hand, men are doing things that can be a form of stress release, but the downside is it relates to lower levels of academic engagement. And when I go around the country and talk about this work, it's the one thing that people are really concerned about is male students and academic disengagement in college. So now moving on to the 3 examples of where there are gender differences in the impact of college. And overall, I will say, if you ask me, are there gender differences in the impact of college? I would say yes. But of over 500 different effects of college that I examined, in only 25% of the cases among these 500 effects, in only 25% of the cases did I find that the effects of college were the same for women and men. So for the vast majority of effects that I found were areas where women and men somehow changed or didn't change in different ways from each other as a result of some experience. So the 3 examples are, the first one is the role of family. That it is very important for women to gain distance from their families. The further away from home that women attend, the more confidence they develop in their leadership abilities, in their scholarly abilities, and in their emotional health. For men, whether they attend college 3,000 miles away or down the street from their families seems to make no practical difference for their development. But this study was done in the 90s, right? So what might this look like today? Well, I've used some other and more recent data to look at not just physical distance from your families, but technological distance. And what I find is that women are spending much more time than men communicating with their parents via email, text messaging, cell phones, and that this level of high-intensity technological connection tends to be debilitating in the sense that it leads to lower levels of academic and social adjustment. So there's a whole area of research we need, even more so on the parent-student dynamic in college. That's next on that list. Okay, and then the other area of difference in the impact of college has to do with the role of faculty. So we find that women's sense of self and their self-confidence tends to be more sensitive to their interactions with faculty. Obviously, the positive and supportive interactions lead to gains in self-confidence, and when women feel that they were dismissed or not taken seriously in the classroom, that's related to declines in self-confidence. Not true for men. Men tend to be a bit more resistant to how faculty treat them. And the final area where, and there's so many of them, but the one I wanted to mention is sports and exercise. For both students, it is true that the more time they spend playing sports and exercising relates to gains in a sense of physical and emotional well-being. But I also find that there are unique benefits for women students, and that comes in the form of lower stress, higher degree aspirations, a more competitive self-confidence, and better grades. And this was not true for the men. For most of those, there was no effect on the men, but when it comes to grades, actually for men, the more sports and exercise predicted lower grades. And I've spent some time talking with people from athletics, and they talk about the much more supportive academic climate for women athletes than we find for male athletes. So there's much more in the book. I just want to make one comment on how this information can be used. For those of you who are in higher education, I see a lot of my students here, and we know that from decades of research on how students are affected by college, we have a very generalized understanding, but we don't have a very specific understanding of how women and men might develop differently and how students of different racial ethnic groups, socioeconomic groups might develop differently in college. So this contributes to the gender aspect of that question. Has implications for people in a range of campus units. And in fact, the last thing I want to mention was that just last month I was invited out to 2 campuses in Minnesota to talk about the book. And one was a women's college, which is the College of St. Benedict's. The other is a men's college, St. John's University. The students live on separate campuses, but they all take classes together. So it's co-ed academic learning, but residentially separate. And the president of St. Benedict's came up to me and she said, every single thing that you wrote in your book is exactly what we're seeing in our campuses. All the dynamics, all the challenges that you write about, it's exactly what we see. And she said that on both campuses, they're using my book in study groups to raise discussions, have discussions with their students, faculty, and administrators about what to do with this issue. On those campuses, gender is a very obvious issue. It's much far further below the surface for most campuses around the country. So that was a very unique situation. But as a researcher, it was really gratifying to hear that the findings were being useful and hopefully will continue to be so for that campus. So I think I'll stop now and let Jane talk about her book.
So
my book, our book, because there's 4 other co-authors, which were graduate students that worked with me on this project, is Stuck in the Shallow End: Education, Race, and Computing. And it's based on about 4 years of research that we did in 3 Los Angeles public high schools around why so few African Americans and Latino students were studying computer science. The book originated, I had done 4 years of research at Carnegie Mellon University on why there's so few women in computer science. And when I was there, I really saw that there was no, I mean literally almost no, African American and Latino students. At this point, African Americans and Latinos combined are about 8% of those getting their degrees in computer science. And there was just so few. I wanted to know what was happening at the high school level, especially since computer science today is a door opener across all kinds of fields, from if you want to be a film animator, if you want to do genetics research, it just opens possibilities to disciplines and to careers. So what was happening from the pipeline from high school to college? And also, computer science is a knowledge that in this country is pretty much acquired getting a jump start is acquired at home with families that have lots of resources and parents that have the knowledge to open the doors to kids. And so this is a knowledge that happens at home and what was happening for other kids and what was happening in schools. So we got funded by the National Science Foundation to do this research in 3 schools. And one was a large 5,000 all Latino school in East LA. One was a predominantly African American school, a lot of middle class students in mid Los Angeles, and another one was a so-called integrated school in a white wealthy part of Los Angeles. So it was schools that somewhat typified what was going on, and they were all digital high schools, they were filled with computers, and there was a lot of focus on getting the schools wired. So what we found was 3 main things that I'm just going to talk about very briefly, and then talk about the title, because that was a big deal about creating this book. We found that there's a real myth about technology as the great equalizer. People in the schools, outside of the schools, parents within the school system hope that technology is going to be the magic bullet, it's going to narrow the achievement gap, it's going to really do a lot for technology. What we found is, regardless of how much technology is in the school, no one was asking which kids are learning what to do with the technology. And what we found were great disparities in that learning. And in the schools with the high numbers of kids of color, what were being offered in the schools was the most basic rudimentary skills, the cut and paste, the point and click curriculum, and none of the what's referred to as computational thinking, the problem solving, the logical thinking that goes into computer science, which is the base of knowledge that allows people to be creators of the technology as opposed to just users of the technology. And so, especially in these schools with high numbers of Latino and African American kids, the most rudimentary, low-level introductory curriculum was present. So great disparities, according to race and class. And what we also found, and the chapters in the book there's a chapter on each one of the schools, and common to all of the schools is this interaction between structural opportunities or lack thereof and belief systems in the schools that sort of rationalize these lack of learning opportunities, especially for kids of color. In the world of computer science, there is an intense beliefs that those who are doing it are the ones that have innate talent. You'll hear expressions all the time. You're just, he's just he. Yes, he. He's just born to do it. You can just see it in the drive. This magnetic attraction between him and the computer. I saw it when he was, this little. And there's these assumptions that those who are doing it are the ones that just have this innate bornness. And as opposed to opportunities that were afforded to them in their homes at a very early age and at school.
And so we found a lot that in these schools were these belief systems that would rationalize why there weren't the courses offered in these schools with high numbers of kids of color. Oh, well, they're just not interested. They just don't take to it. On the contrary, we found kids filled with interest, fascinated with technology, but really no place to go with it. So one of the most tragic was that this, the predominantly African American school, which is a math science aerospace magnet, where kids would describe coming there because they wanted to, learn technology, to do engineering or work with planes, to build guitars, a whole range of interests in which they wanted to go further than point and click. And there was absolutely in this math science aerospace magnet, no aerospace, no computer science, no engineering for these kids to pursue. So the book talks about this intersection of opportunity and belief systems that then rationalize the lack of opportunity for kids of color. And it was a real opening through looking at this one subject, computer science, which ironically is the subject that you hear the government talk about all the time. We need more computer science and engineering talent in this country. This is a priority number one. This is a call to action. This was a window into what was really happening in the schools and how there's a big disconnect between government calls to action and what is happening in education. So while we were wrestling with 4 years of data, in these schools, the interviews with the counselors, the teachers, the students, the principals, looking at curriculum, while we were wrestling with it, I happened to run across an article that talked about African American kids drowning 3 times more than white kids. And this was 2 years ago. And the article talked about the drowning statistics. It talked about how there's greater fear of swimming in African American communities. It talked about swimming as a white sport, the fact that the first Olympic athlete in swimming was not until 2000. And all of these issues around swimming just grabbed me. I mean, what was the deal about the statistic of African American kids drowning 3 times more than white kids? So while I was, supposedly I was studying computer science, I departed on this path and became obsessed with understanding the segregation in swimming. And what I learned through this investigation was that this goes back to probably slavery, definitely goes back to Jim Crow, and the whole history in which swimming were one of the most contested sites. Great opposition from whites to have people of color in the swimming pools. In Los Angeles, this was not just for African Americans, it was all people of color. In Los Angeles, people of color could not swim in public swimming pools except for one night a week, and that was the night before the pools were drained and cleaned. And so there's a whole history across the country of the segregation in swimming, which resulted in people not having good, safe opportunities to learn to swim. Then you sort of roll the camera up to date, and even right prior to the civil rights legislation, if you look at access to swimming in different communities across the country, if you Google Earth right now on Beverly Hills and where the swimming pools are versus South Central Los Angeles, the studies and the statistics about access to swimming opportunities is really still very dramatic. Okay, so there was here this comparison of access to learning opportunities, but then the belief systems. What we discovered is that there were these beliefs, and these beliefs that were rationalizing the lack of access to swimming, and beliefs such that African Americans do not swim because they have thicker bones, they're not as buoyant. And these beliefs actually spread throughout the community, so that coaches today talk about that they have to counteract this belief of kids that quote-unquote blacks are as sinkers. And that this notion that African American families have about both the fear of swimming because of the whole history of it, and this belief that they're not capable for these innate reasons. So in the whole issue of swimming, of what the drowning rates were, and it being a white sport, this same kind of intersection of lack of access to belief systems was operating. And while we found this so compelling, is that often in education you talk about the inequities and people kind of turn off because they go, oh yeah, we've heard this so many years, it goes on for so long, and there's these deep-seated beliefs that really people do have about innate talent. And they feel like they know why certain kids aren't succeeding because of these different innate qualities. And so the metaphor with swimming was so useful for us to talk with teachers and talk to people about, do you really think that it's a segregated sport, or that African American kids are drowning because their parents don't care about teaching them to swim, or they're not interested? But it allows us to open up the whole discussion about the intersection of beliefs and access. So what the title Stuck in the Shallow End became this metaphor that actually the book is about computer science learning, but it's also about a lot more, and it's about how fields become segregated from swimming to computer science, and trying to provide a metaphor for people to grapple with about the process of segregation and how it